Welcome to Nomad Boatbuilding. I'm Mark Rutten, and today we're going to talk about which handheld power tools you need for boat building. Now, the size of boat and the type of construction that you're engaged in is going to have a large bearing on which tools are best suited to your needs, as well as whether or not you're doing repair work or new construction. Repair work requires a lot of innovation and a lot of processes that you would not have to do in new construction, and therefore you're probably going to need a bunch more tools to do that. Now, that said, you don't specifically need any handheld power tools to do any boat building. Of course, we've been building boats for centuries without them. However, they do certainly cut down on the work in some cases. So let's take a look at all the different tools that I employ, and we'll see if we can narrow down the field a little bit for you. You'll notice that a lot of my tools are corded. Most of them are corded and not cordless. And that's because at the time that I was collecting a lot of these up, cordless tools were not quite as viable as they are now. That said, corded tools will last you a lifetime, and cordless ones probably will go by the wayside as the battery technology for them changes. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's one reason I've never gone too deep into cordless tools. Now, you don't acquire all of these power tools in just one shopping trip. Okay, this is not exactly going to be a tool review. However, if I like something, I'll let you know. If I hate something, I'll let you know. Remember, some of these are not necessarily on the market anymore. Some of them still are. Some of them have been improved. Some of them have gotten crappier. I can't say which is which. You'll have to judge that for yourself. But let's just take a look at the general use of these tools and how we apply these to wooden boat building. All right, let's get right into it. Okay, so the big question is, which of these tools do I need for wooden boat building? Well, the answer is kind of all of them, but not really. So let's go through the tools that we have, and I'll just sort of explain how I use them in wooden boat building, and you can have to decide for yourself whether those tools are something that are worthwhile for you to purchase for your activities. 1921, Milwaukee came out with their patent for the Magnum hole shooter. This is what they look like now. This is what they looked like back then. So when I was at boat building school, the Milwaukee Magnum hole shooter was the drill that they recommended that we all get. In fact, they were selling them at the school. That was the only drill that we were expected to acquire for all of our boat building needs. Now you might ask, like, why wouldn't they say get cordless drills or something like that? Well, at the time, cordless drills were just starting to get to where they could do some decent work. The earlier versions of the cordless drills were pretty weak. You know, they could drive some small screws, drill some small holes, but they really didn't have the punch that they do now. And so I was one of very few students who had a cordless drill at all when I got to boat building school. There were a couple other guys who were career carpenters that had cordless drills, but nobody else did. So almost everybody did all of their work that required holes and driving of screws with this. Well, now I should qualify that because we weren't using those to drive screws. We were just using these to drill our holes, do our countersinking, that sort of stuff. Oh, come on, really? All of our screws were being driven by a brace and bit because it's a good controlled way to put a screw in. It still is. But the impact drivers that we have now seem to do a really nice job of driving bronze screws without stressing them and breaking them off. And that is a real concern with bronze screws. They're great once they're in and they're holding the work, but getting them there can be a little bit challenging. The first thing that is an issue is making sure that you don't strip the heads out. And the second issue is making sure you don't actually shear them right off. And they'll tend to break right at the shoulder between the screw and the threads. With a brace and bit, you can be very careful about that, but you could still snap them off. And with drills and drivers, you got to be really careful that you don't do that. Impact drivers seem to do a better job of doing that. Of course, you need to know how to drive an impact driver. There's a little bit of a trick to it if you've never used one, and it really just means you need to have a light touch, go in short bursts, and making sure you're maintaining proper contact with the socket in the screw of whatever type it is. A corded drill like this, the big 1/2-inch chuck, is still a worthwhile thing to have. It's going to go all day long without the batteries wearing out. And if you're driving large diameter holes, something that requires a lot of torque, or you're driving, doing a hole with a long shaft, for instance, you're boring a long shaft hole, it's going to take you a while, this might be the better choice over a cordless tool. But cordless tools are pretty good, and these days most people have larger battery packs on them, and of course multiple batteries, so the recharge time might work out in your favor. If you only have a little bit of money to spend, you can still get a good quality corded drill for probably like 30 bucks or something these days. This one would have been $200 or $300 in its day. And it probably still is fairly pricey, but it's going to last you a lifetime guaranteed. Money aside though, I think your best value is going to be a drill driver combo, regardless of what kind of boat building you do. You really can't beat the freedom you have with cordless tools, obviously. Now, full-size drills and drivers, of course, are going to do the bulk of your heavy work. I personally prefer using these lighter ones. These are 12 volt, and just because I feel it's easier on me in every way, shape, and form. I can stick it in my tool pouch if I have to. It's lighter weight, and I've found that these smaller ones do every bit of the work that these bigger ones do, probably like 75–80% of the time. Okay, now these days we have brushless motors that allow you to get this kind of power into this size package. There's one caveat though. I bought one the other day thinking I'd like to upgrade from these little guys to something with more juice that are still little, but it's the battery pack. You're still working with this big heavy battery pack, and while the tool got a bit smaller, got down to this size, it still had this big battery on it, and in the end, it really didn't make it a whole lot lighter. It's a little bit more compact than these guys, but just by a bit. Is there better performance? Probably. But in terms of just trying to get this tool a bit smaller, it wasn't a whole lot smaller. So for me, at that time, it didn't make sense to upgrade just to replace these, because these are going strong. You can still get these, and the price is quite a bit cheaper. And I'm always amazed at how long these little 12-volt batteries last. There's so many occasions in wooden boat building that we find ourselves in a tight spot that we can't get a regular sized drill into. And so for that reason, a close quarter drill is a great thing to have. But another place that a close quarter drill is really useful is, you see me using it to mix epoxy with a wand, and it's just ergonomically more comfortable to do that. But if you're trying to use a large diameter hole saw, for instance, you're cutting a hole for a mast into a thwart, or maybe you're doing a porthole with a large hole saw, having this longer body makes a huge difference. So as long as you can set it down to a slow speed, you've got this extra torque ability that you have by hanging onto this longer handle, compared to trying to control something like this with a big 6-inch hole saw in it, for instance. Anybody who's tried it will realize you can pretty much snap your wrist off pretty easily. And so having that longer body is night and day different. This Makita one, I've got a few issues with. The battery pack sticks out past the chuck, and so it limits just how tight a space you can get into if the whole thing, for instance, is coming up underneath a thwart, for instance, if you want to fasten, say, a thwart to a knee. I find that kind of frustrating. Now, a little dinky guy like this, and I literally stole this off of my daughters. When you got to get into nooks and crannies, it's kind of a nice thing to have. I certainly wouldn't do much work with it, but there are times when I could get no other tool into the spot that I wanted to get at, and so a little cheapo guy like this that you're going to find at any craft store may not be a terrible thing to pick up. Now, if you needed to do really big stuff a lot and in tight quarters, like say you're working on a boat that has keel bolts that need to be cleaned out from underneath, or holes for keel bolts underneath the keel, and you don't have a lot of space underneath, I would get myself a Milwaukee hole hog. If you're doing large ship construction, like building schooners and things like that, you're probably fastening with lags more than using screws. And so you need something with some power to drive a big lag bolt in, and something like a hole hog is just the ticket for that. It's nice and long, and it's got a lot of power to it. Now, you could probably do a lot of it actually with just an impact driver. You get yourself a little 3/8 or 1/2 inch socket adapter, and now you got some pick crew ability. Now I've got a couple hammer drills here, and there's a reason for that. First of all, this was the first drill that I bought, and I had a workshop that was all concrete. walls, ceiling, floor, the whole thing. To hang anything in that workshop, I needed to drill holes in concrete, so I bought this hammer drill. This drill built my first couple of boats. I didn't have any cordless tools. As long as you have variable speed on the trigger and it's reversible, you can do all the same work you can with a cordless drill using something like this. And here's something I didn't know at the time, and I wish I did. If you put it into the hammer function, the hammer drill function, you can drive screws way easier. It'll drive just like an impact driver because it's basically doing exactly the same thing. Now I have this big old Kanga hammer drill here, and of course this one converts from a drill to actually like a little jackhammer. It eliminates the rotary feature and just becomes a little jackhammer. And why would I want that in boat building? Well, most people wouldn't need that, but if you're working on a larger boat, say a yacht of say 30 feet or more, perhaps you might encounter concrete in the bilges that has been put there as ballast. And if you need to get that out of your way for some reason, you need some power to do that, and a light jackhammer is probably the perfect thing for that. Now, if it's a really big boat, you might need a bigger jackhammer, but for most stuff, this little light one is quite useful. And of course, here in my workshop, you've seen me use concrete anchors in my floor to set up molds and strongbacks and things like that. And well, having a drill that can put a decent sized hole in your concrete relatively quickly is a really nice luxury. So making holes and driving fasteners is one of the biggest tasks we have in wooden boat building, and because of that, a drill, and I would say a drill driver combination, should absolutely be your first purchase. So next up are circular saws, and I would say this is probably the second tool that you're going to want to buy. Now, circular saw is a very, very versatile thing. Of course, it can be a slightly dangerous thing, and a lot of people get intimidated by those. The only way to get over that is to learn a little bit about the safety of the tool and be very, very careful about how you use it. And a lot of that comes down to just securing the work that you're working on and making sure that you aren't sticking any body parts in line with the blade. So circular saws pretty much come in two different varieties. The traditional style is what we would call a sidewinder. The motor is perpendicular to the blade, and of course the blade's always on the right hand side for some reason. I don't know why that is, and I do find it a little bit awkward to have to kind of lean over the machine to see what I'm doing, but I'm sure there are reasons for designing it like that, and if you know what those reasons are, why they're on the right side and not the left side, please let me know. Now, you can get machines in left and right hand configurations, but they're not always readily available. So the Makita Sidewinder, this particular one has got a magnesium base. There's sort of a more basic model of in the Makita line that is just an aluminum plate base, which in fact I think might even be the better machine. I mean, this is a more expensive machine, and I guess the idea is that this magnesium base is going to stay nice and flat on you. I actually find this one's got a little bit of a twist to it somehow. Maybe it got dropped at one point, I'm not too sure, but it really frustrates me. And I know if I had the aluminum base one, I could more easily take it apart and try and flatten it back out. But also the aluminum one gives you the opportunity to drill holes in it and fasten things to it really easily. And for that reason, it might be a great choice if you want a circular saw that's really versatile. Now, if you have a base that's really easy to fasten things to, you can very easily take a circular saw and fasten it underneath a piece of plywood or underneath a thin topped work table, and you could turn it into a little table saw. It's not that difficult to do, and I've certainly done it in the past. This particular saw just doesn't have as many places that I could fasten through the base in order to do that, unfortunately. Of course, there are other brands. I'm not suggesting that Makita is the only brand that you might want to get, but it's the one that I'm most familiar with. And I will say that the Makita saw does a beautiful job of not dropping sawdust right where you're cutting, but ejecting it out the backside here as it should. Not a lot of saws are like that. The second type is the worm drive saw. I grew up in Toronto, and in the contracting world there, nobody used anything but a worm drive saw. You never saw anybody on a job site with a sidewinder. Out here in the West, for some reason, it is, up until recently, it's been the sidewinder has been the king out here. I really have no idea why. But when I wanted to get a bigger saw, I actually had to go through some trouble out here in the West to find this worm drive saw, but I eventually got my hands on one. So I wouldn't use this very often in wooden boat building just because it is a big, heavy, bulky thing. It doesn't drive horizontally very nicely, but when you're doing like construction work and you're supporting like a 2x4 or any 2x material over your foot, using it in a vertical fashion to chop those things to length, it works really, really well. This Milwaukee one is so heavy it pretty much falls right through a 2x4 without even turning the saw on, but it's a good beefy saw and it has a lot of punch to it. It's got an 8¼ inch blade, so if you're doing heavier work, for instance, I would pull this out if I were cutting a larger keel or I were building a mast or a bowsprit or something where that extra bit of cutting depth is going to be useful to me. This guy would come out of the woodwork. But the saw you'll see me turning to more often than not is my little cordless trim saw. I like this obviously for the convenience of it being a cordless tool, but also I like the fact that the blade is on the left-hand side, so I can see, with myself being right-handed, I can see where my line is a little bit more easily. And in wooden boat building, I'll often find myself, especially in repair work, having to cut things in place. And of course, a lightweight saw is critical to doing that job well. Makita also makes a smaller panel saw, which has got like a blade that's, I don't know, maybe it's more like 3 or 4 inches in diameter, which would be kind of a nice thing for some repair work, but I just don't happen to own one, and I haven't found a good reason to buy it yet. These smaller cordless saws, every tool manufacturer in the market has got one, and they're really nice to have. Now, if you're out buying a set of cordless tools, definitely look for one that's got a saw in that set, because I think you're going to find it extremely useful if you have your hands on it. And lastly, every now and then you find something really goofy like this. So this thing does work, but it's pretty goofy. I honestly haven't found an application for it yet, but one of these days we'll figure something out. If I could only buy one, I would probably try and find the lightest weight worm drive saw that I could get my hands on. Just because I like that blade on the inside configuration. With the blade on the right-hand side instead of the left, it's something you certainly get used to. The one thing I will suggest is look at the different blades available. So if you're doing finer work on plywood, you're going to want a blade with as many teeth as possible. And if you're doing stuff ripping solid woods, you probably want to try and find a blade with as few teeth as possible, like a framing blade or something like that. And then I often use the 7¼ inch framing blades on my table saw for ripping stock, especially if you want to make laminations out of narrower stock, just because it's going to save on a little bit of material. So let's talk reciprocating tools now. The most basic one, and the one you probably think you need for boat building, is the jigsaw. I have to say I very rarely pull my jigsaw out. I really just don't like using them that much. While we are cutting a lot of curves in boat building, more often than not, we're kind of cutting large, gentle curves, and I can make a circular saw do that. It's not too often I'm cutting really small, tight curves. Of course, it does happen, and for that, the jigsaw is probably your best bet. But in my workshop, I've got a bandsaw, so I'm probably going to reach for that bandsaw instead. So for me, in my situation, a jigsaw just doesn't get pulled out too often. But that said, let's take a look at some of the features of a jigsaw that might be worth considering. So I like this barrel style as opposed to the D-handled style, and partially because one of the tricks I learned about working with a jigsaw is if you want to get really clean work, you describe your line on the surface of the material you're working with, but then you cut from below. I have an uncle who's a career finish carpenter who taught me that. So in that case, you would hold your jigsaw like so and drive it underneath the work, either towards you or away from you. And this barrel style lends itself to doing that very, very nicely. Another thing I like about this is the fact that this handle on here swivels, so I can sort of more easily control the work that I'm doing if I've got this swiveling control handle here. This is also supposed to allow for quick blade changes, but the mechanism is pretty it's just like doesn't work that well on this particular machine, and I find that rather frustrating myself. It does have this interesting little feature that allows you to change the attitude of the blade, so you can switch it from the blade just reciprocating directly up and down to it having this sort of slight circular motion. And in doing so, you can change its ability to drive faster. So in its vertical orientation, or the zero setting, it is really good for doing really tight turns because the blade's just going straight up and down. But as you click it over to its various other settings, that circular motion increases and it becomes better at driving in a straight line faster. And so you can pick the setting that best suits the size of the curve that you're cutting. So I think that's kind of an interesting detail. The thing that I don't like about jigsaws when it comes to trying to cut long, gentle curves is they just don't necessarily do it that well. Unless the blade is brand new, they tend to want to wander a little bit, and I find that frustrating. So if you had a brand new blade and you were careful at not screwing that up, you could probably set up a nice batten, nailed down to your surface and use the edge of the machine and follow that batten along and just cut a nice gentle curve. That's certainly worth experimenting with. But in general, these blades are just kind of light and whippy and prone to sort of wearing out quickly. And of course, the amount of it, the blade that gets actually used in the cutting, is relatively small, and so that portion will wear out faster, and as soon as that blade's getting worn out, it starts to drift, and their blades are a little bit on the pricey side given how quickly they burn out on you. Now, this is the only jigsaw I've ever bought, so I can't really speak to any others, and the only others I've used have been the real junky sort of Black & Decker ones from the 1960s and 70s, which are pretty rude. So this was definitely a huge improvement over the junkier D-handled styles, or the cheap ones. I'm sure there are better ones out there. I just couldn't tell you which ones they are. Speaking of D-handled jigsaws, I picked this up the other day at a thrift shop. It was just $5, so I thought it was kind of fun. And it's a Craftsman by Sears, and they refer to it as a scroller saw. So check that out. And what's kind of cool about this is that this little knob here turns just like on that Bosch, except the difference being is the whole arbor here turns along with it, which means I can be driving along and suddenly make a right-hand turn without changing the attitude of the body of the saw. In fact, I could go into a corner, turn around, and come back again, which I think is kind of a hilarious feature. I don't know how practical that is, and I haven't even plugged this in to try it out yet, but we will have to give it a shot and see how it works. I just think that's really funny. And apparently this is variable speed too. Now, if there's one reciprocating tool that I would highly encourage you to get for wooden boat building, it is a multi-tool. For some reason, so many of these multi-tools seem to advertise themselves as being like this little triangular corner sander thing, which is about the most useless feature on these machines. I mean, I've got one. I think I've never even made it through all the sanding pads that are in sort of the starter pack that came with this thing. But what it is beautiful for is, of course, it's the little thin blades that can reciprocate and drive directly into any surface that you need them to go into. There's a little trick to making those drive really well without them wandering, and to be able to sort of be productive about it. And it just involves sort of being careful about how you angle the blade a little bit. And now mine is a Fine Multimaster. I believe Fine are the guys that sort of first came out with this type of tool, and I'm pretty sure they must have had a pretty strong patent that prevented everybody else from coming out with one, because when I bought this was the only one on the market. Since then, the market has suddenly exploded with these multi-tools. So you can certainly pick one up much cheaper than I did. I think I probably paid about $400 for this thing at the time, maybe more. And it was a huge investment, which I immediately regretted not making sooner once I started using it. You may not use this a lot in new boat building construction. However, if you're repairing anything, this will be your savior for sure. because it can cut holes in places that nothing else can. It can do the most surgical job of cutting things out that nothing else can. So definitely worth considering. And what I like about the fine tools is they give you a really nice long extension cord on them. This one's also relatively quiet, and it doesn't, like, the tool itself doesn't vibrate like crazy. So it does a really good job of delivering all the vibration right to the blade, which is probably something a junkier tool is not going to do very well. Now, of course, the Sawzall reciprocating saw, in wooden boat building, we're not likely to pull this out very often. It may come in handy if you're cutting really large stock. Say you've got a beam for a keel or something, and your circular saw can only get so far from each side, and you got to cut out the rest in between. You might pull out a Sawzall to finish off that cut. If you're doing repair work on larger boats, this is going to be a fairly important tool to have on hand, although certainly not much of a precision tool, but guaranteed there's going to be some bolts that you got to cut away and that sort of thing. So it's definitely something, if you're into larger boats, you will find yourself buying at some point, but it's certainly not something you need to buy until you actually need the machine. Okay, so where would we be without sanders in wooden boat building? If there's one handheld power tool besides the drill that you will probably find yourself really wanting, I mean, your drill is pretty much, you'd be stupid not to have them, drill and driver, and it'd be pretty damn hard to get along without a circular saw. I think the next one that you would absolutely be wise to pick up is probably a belt sander, more so than a random orbital sander. I know most people will run out and they'll buy a little palm sander of some sort as sort of probably their first sander. But when it comes to a lot of boat building stuff, there's some major shaping that we do that a belt sander is going to do better than anything else. If we're doing a lamination, for instance, gluing up a whole bunch of stuff and there's tons of glue squeeze out, epoxy probably, well, a belt sander is going to be your best tool for sort of getting rid of all that stuff that's on the surface before you can finish your shaping job. Now, you might notice that Makita tools turn up in my collection a lot. I mean, that's probably the one brand that I have the most of. Next would be Milwaukee. There's two reasons for that. First of all, I'll always pick up a Milwaukee if I want something that's absolutely like a tank that is not going to wear out. The Milwaukee tools are the ones that I'm going to probably grab without thinking. If I want something with finesse, I have found that the Makita tools do a really good job of providing a tool that has some finesse. Now, this particular sander here I got as a trade when I was buying my first bandsaw. I got them to throw this in, basically. And that was 25, almost 30 years ago, and it's still going. And the design hasn't changed in all that time. And that's the thing that I like about Makita tools, is it feels like they have done a really good job of designing them in the first place. And once they're done and they're out there, they seem to stick around. The design changes very, very little over time. And that suggests to me that they actually did a really good job initially, and they found very little that needs changing to make the tool better than it is. So this particular one has eventually sort of given me a little bit of trouble. The belt doesn't want to track properly anymore, and I've been unable to diagnose exactly what's going on with it. And I've tried just about everything to figure it out. But it's been a good machine. And what I like about this particular model, and which model is this one? This is the 9924 DB. So it's a 24-inch belt. You can stick up to like a 3 or 4 inch wide belt onto here. So the sanding belt itself can protrude past the wheels. So the platen size is the thing that determines how big a belt you can put on. What I like about this is it's just small enough that you can use it in a vertical fashion. You know, you can work the face of a stem perhaps, or you can get it up onto a keel. It's got enough power that it's going to do a heavy sanding job, but it's just light enough that you still have some dexterity with it. Now, its big brother here is an absolute tank. And you know, if you could use this as a snow plow if you put a blade on the front of it. It's got that much pooch to it. I'm really impressed with how nice a job this thing does. Like, I was reluctant to buy it at first. In fact, I was shopping for another one of these, and there were none available in my area. So I ended up buying this bigger one, and I have to say I was really pleased I did. You don't have the dexterity with it. I mean, I wouldn't want to be using it in any other orientation but flat. But used flat, man, it does a fantastic job. Now, the one I love the most is this little guy, and unfortunately not on the market anymore. I think some people call this the armadillo sander. I don't really have a name for it. But this little porta-cable sander is almost like it's a belt sander version of a block plane. And in wooden boat building, man, I've found so many occasions where I would use this. I would especially use this if I've got like rub rails or something and I want to doctor up the very ends where they meet a stem. Well, this has got the dexterity to sort of do that. You can use it one-handed, or you could not, certainly wouldn't want to use any of these other guys one-handed. And for working on small stuff that these bigger ones might shoot across the room or gobble up, this guy is going to do the job very nicely. No less useful is this guy. This is probably one of the few Makita tools that is still made in Japan. It is a beautiful little belt sander. I find I use it more for metal work than for woodwork. But I did buy it because I wanted a belt sander that had high dexterity that I could use for dressing off frames and be able to sort of control the angle nicely. And I think I needed to get into some tight spots when I bought it. There was a specific job I had to do, and it felt like this was going to be the thing to do it. And I think it did it okay. But I would say this is a huge luxury and not the kind of thing I would really worry about buying necessarily. But if you want to know what a really nicely made machine feels like, this is definitely one of them. So if I were buying tools for the first time, I would just buy any belt sander that fits your price range because you're going to get a lot of use out of it. And one little thing, where'd it go? I've got this little thing that I've made that just drops onto the handle here. And so I'll put this in the vise on my bench, and then it allows this to drop in there and just keep it from scooting around. Now I've got a little belt sander machine, like a stationary machine, which is great if you've got little small parts that you're trying to do and you're trying to be very careful about the angles, the lines you hit. That's the way to go, because if you're trying to sort of do something small with a belt sander held like this, well, you can't see what you're doing, so it's almost impossible. Now, another thing you can do with a belt sander is you can consider, up to a point, you could add a shim to the bottom of the platen here. You could even potentially take like something soft like this felt pad here. You'd have to figure out a good way to stick it on there. Maybe use a little bit of spray adhesive, but then you can create a slightly convex sanding melt. And that might be just the thing you need to get, say, onto the inside of some deck beams or something like that. Now, Makita, and I know Makita makes sort of a rotary sander, which is basically like a big wheel, and you can get brushes on it, different kinds of wheels for it, which might be a nice little thing. And I know there's a few other manufacturers that have been doing that, but I don't think you can have the control over the shape that you would with something with a gentler curve. Staying in the category of sanders, your two primary sanders that you may already own or you're likely thinking about shopping for are your what we call the jitterbug sander or quarter sheet sander and a random orbital sander. Now, of course, there's the half sheet version of this, which you've probably seen around. I don't own one. I don't think I'll ever own one because they're not all that useful. Compared to a belt sander, they're just not that useful. And even a jitterbug sander is marginal in its use. However, if you need to sneak up on the edge of something without messing it up, a jitterbug is the thing that's going to do that. If you need to sneak into a corner, a jitterbug's probably going to do that better than a random orbital. There aren't that many good ones on the market, though, and this one, unfortunately, is probably off the market. But this particular one is a beautiful machine that delivers all of the jitter down to the sole of it or the platen, and leaves none of it up here in the handle where you're hanging on to it. So I think when I went shopping for this, the salesman plugged one of these in and he just put it on my hand and he said, feel that. And you could just see this thing sort of staying stationary and just the bottom jiggling around. And I said, sold. Never regretted that purchase. Now I have burned through, I don't know how many random orbital sanders. There are better ones and cheaper ones. The sort of more pro quality ones that are out there, like what is it, Merca, I think is the name. Frankly, I'm not dropping $1,000 on a sander, and I'm sure they're good machines. I find them a bit of a wallet choker myself. So your typical $100 palm sander is probably the thing, if you're just getting into it, is the thing you're going to buy. Now, I don't actually pull mine out all that often. I find in wooden boats, we're dealing with curved surfaces. If I didn't sand it with a machine before it went into the boat, I'm unlikely to try and grab a sander to try and sand something once it's on the boat, because more often than not, the surfaces that you're working on are now curved, and these just don't follow curves very well. Of course, you can get different density of sanding pad on there, so some are softer than others, and so they could conform to a curve a little more easily. For a lot of people, this is, they're hanging on to this all the time. For myself, I don't really pull it out that often. I'm more inclined to hand sand than to pull out a random orbital sander. If you are going to get one, though, I would try and find one that has good dust pickup. This one I've got it set up to hook up to my shop vac, so it's okay. Now let's not forget, angle grinders can be used as sanders. Of course, you have to get a proper backing pad for it, and then of course sanding discs and different grits. Now they're pretty brutal for sanding, but they can certainly do the job, and they're more for rough shaping than doing any real finishing in terms of woodworking with them. And of course, you can get little chainsaw bits and diamond burr bits that will go onto a grinder to shape wood. Again, pretty brutal stuff and more of a carver's tool than anything else. But there are times when a sanding disc on an angle grinder is just the thing, especially if you're doing heavier construction and you're, say, doing the butt ends of planks or something, like for butt blocks, and you just need to shave it down a bit. Just taking a little off the butt end of a heavier plank, the angle grinder is probably the thing you'll reach for. And you've probably seen Louis Chazad, who's got like a circular saw blade set up on a grinder in order to cut scarves on boats in situ, which scares the daylights out of me, but good on him for trying to find a better way to do things. Now, corded grinders are so cheap, it makes no sense not to buy several of them. And I think I have like 5 or 6 grinders now, because when I'm doing metal work, I'll keep one set up with a flap wheel, another one set up with a cutoff wheel, another one set up with a wire wheel. It's one of those tools that they're almost disposable, but they last a long time. So if you can get one for $50 or something like that, it's probably worthwhile. Now the last thing is sort of this big buffer sander. Now this is not random orbital. It's just orbital, and so to use it as a sander does take a little bit of finesse in order to not have it sort of scurrying around all over the place and leaving marks. So it takes a light touch. You can certainly use it for buffing if you're into that sort of thing. I don't need it for buffing. However, if you're doing fairing on a larger boat, so you're fairing out a deck, a wooden deck, or even the hull sides of a larger boat, one of these guys with a square or rectangular disc is the way to go, because this turns it into basically like a random orbital sander. Because it's not round, there's no specific edge that can dig in and leave swirl marks. So you just take these guys, you glue a whole piece of sandpaper on there, and you go to it. And you could even take a piece of plywood that's a bit light, that's got some flexibility to it, so you could work it into some slight concavity if you had to. So that's just a little trick that's specific to the boat building trade, making your own fairing sander using one of these guys. Now the kind of nice thing about this particular machine, though, over anything else, is that it can run real slow because it's for buffing. We'll fire it up to full speed. It goes 3,000 RPM. So I was holding a little dust there, okay? But, and you notice that soft start? That's really valuable if you're trying to not mess up something that you're working on. But we'll just dial it right down here to, goes all the way down to 600. So it's nice and slow, soft. So you can get some really good control and be delicate about what you're sanding. If you're just getting started in boat building, you're probably just going to end up getting any old random orbital sander in the 4 or 5 inch range, and that's probably going to work for you just fine. If your budget can tolerate it, it might be worth looking at the Festool or the other pro quality machines, because they're likely going to have lower vibration, which is better on your body, because you'll find your hands jiggling after an hour hanging onto one of these, and you're probably going to get much, much better dust extraction, because these sort of consumer models are meh at best. Focus. All right, routers. You definitely don't need a router for boat building exactly. You can probably get through an entire boat building project without a router. However, there are certain times when a router is awfully useful for certain things, especially when it comes to putting profiles onto things like rub rails and such. Now you can do all of that by hand, you can do all that with a spoke shave, you can rough stuff out with a table saw or circular saw to sort of knock off major corners and then finish up by hand with a spoke shave and stuff. Certainly a router is going to get you to a finished profile faster. Routers come in different sizes, and if there's one router that I would definitely use on virtually every boat building project, it's going to be a little one like this, a little what we in the past would have referred to as a laminate trimmer. Not sure what people are calling them right now, palm routers or something like that, maybe they're calling them. But I mean, originally these were pretty much for the countertop, the kitchen countertop tray to trim arborite or melamine laminates off of panels, right? For boat building, they're great because we can put at least small diameter profiling bits into there, flush trim bits for sure, quarter round bits, probably about up to maybe 3/8, maybe a 1/2 inch radius you could probably get away with. And I certainly use it for chamfering bits, whatever will sort of fit through the throat plate here. And of course you could put collets on there to follow patterns. So I'll use this a lot for profiling rub rails and little details using chamfering and roundover bits. But I also use it an awful lot in repair work for creating pockets to put Dutchmen into. So anytime you have a little rot pocket or a piece of damaged area in a surface of some wood and you need to fill that with something, it's the laminate trimmer that I will probably turn to. Because it's so small and light, with a small diameter bit, you can freehand quite easily, and you could also use templates and things like that, as I say. If it's got a round base, you might want to check that it's consistently centered on the bit if you're going to use it to follow, say, a straight edge or something like that. I kind of like this one is not square, it's rectangular, so you get a slightly different dimension on each side. And I find that it actually can come in handy once in a while. This particular laminate trimmer, I don't love the way that the base fits on here. It's always just a little bit fiddly and never feels like it's never like 100% square, it feels like. And I've screwed around with it I don't know how many times. I never quite got it to where I like it. But I kind of like the overall shape of it, and I like the simplicity of it. That one's nice. Actually, I've got the Home Depot brand, the, what is it, HDX or something? One second. No, I was wrong. Rigid. I got the Rigid one. I love this one. This is a great little laminate trimmer. Round base, small base on it. They provide a square base that can go on there. They provided a fence to be able to do operations including that use a fence. I've actually made other fence related jigs that just use the same rod sizes, rod holes. And what I love this sort of mechanism they have for the base. So just a cam lever to loosen off the base. You got a thumb screw for micro adjusting, but then you got this little lever that allows you to just slide it to wherever you want to get the major adjustment done. What I like about this is the combination of having this cam lock and this micro adjusting means I can sort of use it a little bit like a plunge rotor. Start out with it just like a hair above the work, and then I'll slowly, when I'm trying to do just sort of fine stuff, I'll slowly dial it in with the thumb screw here, or the micro adjuster, until it's just starting to bite where I want it, coming down just that small little amount, and then I'll close off this guy and start rotating. So I have not exactly a plunge rotor operation, but it's kind of close. Now, I think you can get plunge rotor bases that will fit some of these small palm rotors. I don't have one, and I haven't seen one available, but I'm pretty sure I've seen some people have something that looks like they might have found one somewhere. So if you know of one, put it in the comments, please. So the rigid one here, I like the sort of on-off button is very obvious, so you know what's on, you know what's off, compared to other ones, which is where you're kind of like, huh, maybe? They kind of printed on and off on there, and you're never 100% sure whether or not you've got it on or off before you plug it in. This is really obvious, so that's nice. Feels good in the hand, nice and light, and quite economical. So I think this one was $100, maybe it was even a bit less. Great value for your money. So, and not crazy loud too. Some of these can be real screamers. This one isn't too awful. Although all rotors are pretty loud, I will tell you that right now. So I'll big thumbs up to the rigid guys for producing that one. Dremel tool is basically a little router. And if you acquire a router base for it, you actually turn it into a router. Not very useful for boat building, I don't think, unless you got some really small little things that you're trying to repair. It's probably fairly uncommon. You're going to have stuff that's so small that you need this, but it's possible. Some people might use it to, say, clean out the grooves of some decking or something in a very small boat. But you're very limited to the size of router bit you can put into something like this. Maybe 3/16 of an inch at most, I'd say. There's probably you can probably get a 1/4 inch bit, but I mean, there's not a lot of juice in a Dremel tool. However, having a little Dremel tool like this might be, if you're doing repairs, could be just the thing you need for cutting a little bolt free that's seized up somewhere and you can't get anything else into it. And if you're just needing to shorten up small fasteners like machine screws and things like that, you know, a little cutoff wheel on a Dremel tool might be the best thing for that too. So not an absolute necessity, but you know, it could come in handy. Now moving up, you would have your stationary base router. This one's quite a cheap one, an old Makita one. The reason to have something like this in a situation where you need to like hold it up again, and you don't want the weight of a really big router, and you need a little bit more oomph than you're going to get out of a laminate trimmer. Now, I would use a laminate trimmer first wherever I can, but sometimes you want something with more control, a little bit more power, and so probably a fixed base router might be the thing to go with. I don't use this very often, but it's certainly kicking around. Now, the real workhorse is the plunge router, and when it comes to plunge routers, there's a good chance you'll want a fairly beefy one. So what is this guy? This guy is 15 amps. Is it Porter cable? There was another one that at the time this was out was sort of the big hefty one that a lot of people got, that was like another horsepower heavier. The one time you do tend to use a router a lot is when you're trying to like straighten the edges of fairly heavy boards, or doing larger excavations of things. And that's where you would really want a plunge router. This particular one is these Makitas, at least of this era, they have actually a fairly quiet motor. I imagine the newer ones across the board are probably all a lot quieter, but these guys made a point of trying to make a quiet router. It is not quiet by any stretch of the imagination, but in comparison to its brethren of the day, this thing was practically silent. I'm not sure if they still make it or if it's still available. There was a time when I'm pretty sure Bosch had a nice sort of mid-sized router. It was probably like 3/4 horse or something like that, that came with both a fixed and a plunge base. So, you know, more bang for your buck, that's probably worth looking into. So I would put a router into the luxury category of boat building. There are plenty of boats that I've built where a router did not come out at all. But if a router did come out, 100% it would have been that one. So this is where I would put my money before any of the others. And routers are kind of funny in that if you go hit your thrift stores, you'll probably find some older routers available that are still viable. I mean, the newer routers have a lot of bells and whistles in terms of micro adjustments, but the basic anatomy of it hasn't changed at all. You know, it's just a motor spinning around with a chuck. So you can get some really good deals, and maybe it's worth your while if you use certain bits a lot to try and pick up old used routers and just keep them chucked up with those bits that you use all the time. Like always have one with a flush trim bit in it, for instance. Always have one with your 3/4 inch round over, or you know, whatever it is that you do with some frequency. I think that would be worthwhile doing. I'm going to plug a book, and that's this one, How to Build Glued Lap Strike Wooden Boats by John Brooks and Ruth Ann Hill. So what I like about this book is he's got some great tips in there about doing things with circular saws and routers and such that are a little off the normal beaten path. And so he has a great technique for using a router to joint the edge of a board for a transom, for instance, in such a way that you can make a perfect fit between two adjacent boards. Really kind of cool trick. I've never seen it presented in any other book like that. And he has some neat ideas about using circular saws and adding a few little accessories onto them so that they can sort of follow a batten and cut you a nice gentle curve for a plank. So that's a great book to check out. Even if you're not building glued lap strike boats per se, there's going to be a ton of just applicable information in that book for any project you get into that's boat building related. I want to make a quick case for air tools. We don't typically use nailers and pinners in boat building, mostly because the fasteners available for those tools are not really marine grade. Even the stainless steel brads you might get are probably meh at best. So I'd be feeling kind of nervous about using them in any sort of typical boat building construction. Now maybe in a situation where you've got parts that are buried in epoxy and no water is getting to them, an encapsulated boat, I might feel sort of okay. But even still, when you put a fastener like that into a boat, guaranteed, you're just setting up some other guy for a bunch of grief when he goes to or she goes to do some repair work down the road and their saws are hitting a bunch of nails that you've left behind that they couldn't see or didn't expect. So for that reason, I tend to not use air tools in the actual construction. However, we use them all over the place in the work that's related to boat building. So in terms of building jigs or setting up molds and things like that, air tools are a wonderful time saver. Now there's one exception to what I've just said, and that is this guy. This is a gun by Omer, and it uses these fasteners that are made by a company called Raptor. So this gun in particular uses plastic brads. When I was first presented with these, I was sold on the idea that when you send these into the work you're doing and they would kind of melt themselves into the wood, leaving you like filling their own nail hole so that you didn't need to putty a nail hole afterwards. And I wouldn't say that they really do that job all that well. Partially because it's kind of a fiberglassy fastener. It's not, I mean, it's plastic, but it's a fairly rigid plastic. And there's no depth control on this gun. You'd have to use like the air pressure control to control how far this nail goes in. So in some materials, it's going to go in deep and leave a hole that you need to fill, and in some it's going to stay a bit proud. So it's a bit iffy. Now, however, where I have found them really useful is in my Catalina Wary series. You'll see I'm using it as a temporary fastening method. So I'm using it when I'm gluing up planks. I'm actually nailing the planks on with these guys. The plastic nails stay behind, but they don't become anything. They're just inert, and you can sand or cut through them without great damage. They do kind of chew up sharp edge tools like chisels and planes a little bit, but nothing that's a really big deal. So they're kind of cool that way. The nail itself doesn't have a ton of strength, but it is a great temporary fastener. If you're into doing some CNC work, you need to fasten a piece of material down to your table and then do a bunch of cutting on it. Like, this is the thing to use, because bump, 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 bunch of nails to hold it down, and then when you're done, you just give it a knock and they'll just break free, no problem. So this guy is your 28 gauge pinner. So those are very, very, very light pins. They're headless, so we don't exactly use them in boat building, again, just like the regular brad nailer or 1/4 inch crown stapler. That's what this one actually is. But I will use it in my repair work to temporarily hold patterns and battens and things onto a boat that I'm trying to do some work on, because these little thin 28 gauge brads, they leave like such a tiny hole that it's easy to fill them up with even paint. And so I like them as a temporary fastener. And they usually, if you're lucky, if it's going into soft wood like cedar planking, it's usually pretty easy to draw it out. And I really like it for that reason. Of course, the plastic nailer might be a good choice for that too, but I like the fact that I can walk away and leave no fastenings behind, whereas I'm still leaving little bits of plastic behind with this guy. So in the boat shop, this one's a 1/4 inch crown stapler, so I will find this is really useful for assembling molds and things like that, because it's got some decent holding power over a brad nailer. But I find good uses for either one. I use brad nails a lot for temporarily holding patterns and things down, because I find that brads are fairly easy to pull out. And then the last thing is just a pneumatic stapler. And if you're doing canoe restoration, for instance, and doing like cedar canvas canoe recanvassing, trying to use a manual stapler to staple canvas onto a canoe, if you do that as opposed to putting it on with brass tacks, it's really difficult to do with a manual. And I used to use an electric, but I could never get an electric to last for even one box of staples before the thing would die on me. So these pneumatic ones, they're really cheap. They're maybe 50 bucks or something like that. Now, the other place that we use staplers in the boat shop is when we're making patterns or spiling for things. So we need to be able to sort of put together little pieces of door skin in situ, and I think it's nice to have a gun that can put that fastener in quickly and without jarring everything around, compared to trying to do it with a manual stapler, where there's no way you can be gentle about putting a staple in manually. The pneumatic stapler is definitely a nice thing to have on hand. Now, since you've got a compressor going already, if it's a decent size compressor, all of these little guys can run off of, I don't remember what you call them, but just little tubby tank compressors, you know. But if you get a compressor with a decent tank size, you can start using other air tools, rotary air tools. Now, I've got a couple of them here, a right angle one and a straight one. So, you know, one of them I'll use with little sanding discs on it and wire brushes and stuff. I find they're really hard to control for speed. They just basically go like bananas. They are variable speed, but it's really hard to get them to move at a variable speed. They just tend to want to go like full bore all the time. I will say that they're cheap, you know. For under $100, you can acquire a little tool like this that might be just the thing to get into a tight spot that an electric tool might not get into. This one too, the little die grinder. Every now and then this can come in handy to chop something away. Now you can get little pneumatic reciprocating saws, so like a little hacksaw blade. That could come in real handy in repair work. Definitely, and it would work a lot like a multi-master in that case. And then of course you can get pneumatic sanders and body files and stuff like that. You do need like a pretty big tank to run that sort of thing, because these things burn through the air quite quickly. So if you don't have particularly large air reserve tank on your compressor, you're not going to get very far with this. So the little tiny compressors that you almost get packaged up with your brad nailer, it's probably not going to get you very far with these rotary tools. And then lastly, these things are loud as bejesus, so wear your hearing protection if you're going to use them at all. What would I consider actually necessary for boat building? Well, certainly not these. I would say the stapler is worthwhile getting just because it is so cheap. And if you're already getting a compressor anyway, which, you know what, if you got a workshop, get a compressor. You will not regret it. It is one of the most useful things to have as a piece of shop equipment. But to that end, I would probably just get like a crown stapler would be the first thing I would get in terms of being able to sort of build jigs around the shop, because the crown staples hold things together quite nicely. And then the brad nailer, would be my second choice as the thing to get. These other guys are nice to have, but they're a little bit of a luxury. And the plastic nailer, even though this is the most applicable to boat building, is the most expensive of the lot. So that's going to run you a couple of $100 at least for this gun, just because it's a weird specialty item. And the brad nails, these plastic brads that go into this, will not effectively go through a standard brad nailer. These are purposely built for the plastic nails. You'll probably get like constant jams happening in the regular brad nailer, so it's not really worth it. Now, the downside to using one of these is you're not going to get those nails at your local hardware store. You're going to have to special order them in. But they come in different lengths, different gauges, and you can even get them in different colors sometimes. There's one more thing I wanted to say about the plastic nailer, is they also make plastic staplers. So if you're doing cold molding, I would say 100% go get yourself one of the plastic staplers, because you can't do better than having plastic staples that you put in that you don't have to worry about pulling back out again. It's almost, you'd be crazy not to. So that's something to consider. As I said, the construction technique you are using is going to have a large bearing on which tools that you need. Okay, now I'm just going to show you a few oddball ones that don't really fall into any other category. Glue gun. So I definitely use a glue gun a lot, and I use it entirely in the pattern making process. And so I think it's really worthwhile getting yourself a decent glue gun. Of course, I've had all kinds of cheap ones, and I particularly like this one, slightly higher end. I don't remember what I paid for it. It was definitely more expensive than your average craft store one. But it comes up to heat very quickly, and that's one of the reasons I chose it. And their glue guns are starting to come back in fashion in the construction industry for all sorts of applications. So you're starting to get professional quality glue guns available. If you go to your contracting stores and have a look in the contractor section, the professional section, you'll probably find a glue gun there that they're using for flooring and baseboard applications and stuff like that. So it's something that is came out back in the 70s. I remember my dad getting a glue gun, the very first Bostic glue gun, when it was basically the size of an old Black & Decker drill. And then they sort of got relegated to this sort of cheesy craftwork world. And they seem to be coming back as sort of a really viable tool with the right kinds of glue sticks. You can do all kinds of stuff with them. So for us, pattern making, spiling of things, being able to put together little pieces of door skin to create a pattern to follow. So that's where a glue gun is being used in boat building almost all the time. And of course, you can do other sorts of little jiggy things with it too. If you've got a plank that's got a real wind to it, and you need to try and plane it flat, you get a piece of plywood, you put your plank on there and use a glue gun to glue in little shims to hold up the wonky corners so that you can send it through the thickness planer and get it flat. So definitely worth getting one. And you know what? I don't know why I don't have a cordless one. I really should, because it would be really handy to have one of those. I should look around. If you know a good quality cordless one, let me know. Okay, heat gun. Not so much something we'll use in new construction very much, But in repair work, we will use it a lot. You use it for stripping paint, you use it for softening up old bedding compounds and putties. This particular one gets hot enough that I can solder with it, believe it or not. So this is not a cheap one. I think I spent at least a couple of $100, maybe almost $300 on this particular one, but it's got temperature control on it, you know, a good temperature control. And because I spent that much money on it, I would feel comfortable turning it on, you know, and walking away from it for a good length of time while it's still running. So you could use it in all kinds of situations where you're just trying to, say, drive some heat towards something and it's going to take a while. Don't have to have it, but if you're going to do repair work, I can't imagine that you're not going to find immediate use for that in the project. Okay, slightly weirder one is a hot knife. Now, I spent a lot of years without one of these, but now that I've got one, I kind of regret that I didn't buy one a lot earlier. And where you would use this in small boats is if you're doing rigging and stuff like that, and you're working with usually synthetic lines, and you need to cut those lines, and you don't want to, you want to be able to sear the ends. Even if you're going to be splicing, you still need to sort of trim away those ends and sear off the raw ends a little bit. And so a hot knife is really convenient. And if you're doing skin-on-frame construction using synthetic skins, this is the bomb for cutting those skins to shape as you're doing the skinning process. And for years I used a knife over a torch, and it just took forever to do it. And I finally broke down and bought one of these things, and I feel like an idiot for not doing that sooner. I'd say if you're a skin boat builder, this falls into the necessary category. It's probably like the only power tool I would really say you gotta have for skin boat building, weirdly. But for other kinds of boat building, it's a little bit on the frivolous side. The plate joiner or biscuit joiner, and I'm gonna lump the domino joiner into the same category. I just don't happen to own one of those. I would never buy one of these specifically to use in boat building. However, if you've got one of these, you can find uses for it in boat building. So I would use it when I'm creating a transom, glue up panels to make a wider board for a transom, for instance. I prefer to use splines for that, to do a really nice job of it. I'll put a hardwood spline into the joint as opposed to biscuits. But biscuits are just pretty fast and easy, and so there's plenty of times where I'm like, oh, I want to get this done. And so I will employ biscuits for that. Now, the downside about using biscuits in boat building is the biscuits themselves are made out of beech. And beech is not a very durable wood. In fact, beech absorbs water like crazy and it expands a lot. So it's not necessarily the best choice. They even use it to split rocks in quarries. They'll drill holes and put beech pegs in there and add water to them, and they'll... So when I do use it, I'll often make my own biscuits. If I'm using it and the joint where that biscuit is going to be used is being cut, and that there's a chance that that biscuit will be exposed, we'll definitely make my own biscuits out of a bit of mahogany. And I'll only use the beech biscuits if that joint is going to stay fully buried and glued so that that biscuit never sees the light of day. I would say the same thing for the domino joiner. Now, there's just not a lot of situations where you would use it as a joinery tool beyond panel glue-ups in boat building. But I have used it in a lot of sort of funny situations where it allowed me to make a joint or do a repair that was stronger than if I didn't use it. And a good example is I've made quite a number of kayak paddles and used a biscuit joint to attach a hardwood end onto a softwood paddle, and it's basically a butt joint. So definitely falls into the sort of not unuseful category, but definitely not necessary category. Now, if you thought boat building would get you out of doing housework, you're wrong. So something to really consider is a nice shop vac. And if you're working on yachts or something where you're going to have a bunch of cleanup inside, having something that's small and portable is not a terrible idea either. And you wouldn't necessarily think about these in the handheld power tool department, but in boat building, we produce a lot of chips, and we tend to send those chips into things that have a lot of nooks and crannies, namely the insides of boats. And so it can be kind of difficult to get all of those out. You can't always sweep them out, and we don't really want to blow them out with a compressor if we can avoid it, just because that just sends a lot of sawdust airborne. So I like having a good quality shop vac, and I'm making a case for spending a little bit more on a shop vac than you're not necessarily inclined to. This one was probably about $300 or $400 at the time that I bought it. Been like 15 years? Yeah, about that. It's been a fantastic tool. This Fine is probably the quietest shop vac that's on the market. Now, we use it not just for getting chips out of the boats that we're building, but when in the finishing process, we're doing a lot of dust removal in preparation for paint and varnish. And so we want to be able to do that effectively. And to that end, a shop vac that has a really nice flexible hose that isn't too heavy and isn't too bulky is a nice thing. So I wouldn't want one of those ones with a big 2.5-inch hose on it. That would be really awkward to use. And of course you want to get one, be able to put a nice bristle brush on the end for getting all that dust off. Now, this particular shop vac comes with a pretty good length hose. The hose itself is about 16 feet long, so I can leave it parked at one end of a canoe and go down one side and then down the other without the machine having to follow me. The cord on the machine is particularly long, and I've added an extra extension cord so I can leave this plugged in anywhere in the shop pretty much and still be able to get the hose to where I want it. Now, to that end, I have added a little feature of this little remote control off a Christmas tree. And I don't know why shop vacs don't come with this stock, because this dumb little accessory I've added on here saves me hours and hours of running back and forth to a shop vac to turn it on and off. It's like I couldn't live without it now. I need to try and come up with a more elegant solution than this, but this has been working just fine for years. So that's a little hack that you can try yourself. Now, when I'm doing stripping of canoes and things like that, it produces a lot of gunk that you can scrape out some of it, but not all of it. And so depends on the stripper I'm using, some of the strippers stay very wet. And so I have like a really crappy old shop vac that I use for slurping that stuff up. There's a nice felt filter bag, overbag inside there that I don't want to muck up with a bunch of chemically goo. So I'm a little bit not precious about how I use this, but I don't use this as a wet vac is what I'm saying. Now, the only downside to this Fine machine is that they've got a non-standardized dongle on the end here, which drives me nuts because I'm just about worn out the Fine accessories that I've got. I need to replace those, but there's nothing in the Canadian market that matches this diameter. So I should either have to build an adapter or try and find myself a new little dongle end for this hose. I'm not sure if I can. They're probably out there, but I'll probably find out the hose itself is a non-standard size as well. So that's just one of the problems with buying European-produced tools here in North America, I suppose. Fine weirdly came up with a solution to their non-standard parts by providing this little piece of rubber hose that you can use to stick on the end of this and stick the other end onto whatever you can lay your hands on, which is a bit of a cheesy solution, but what are you going to do? It's a solution nonetheless. But I really got to find a better fix for this. Okay, so our very last item is the power planer, which is where the hell's my power planer? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, well, no power plane? Not a problem. as you know, I am not really a fan of the power plane. I just have a tough time trying to have much finesse with them. I do use them, but you know, they throw chips everywhere, they're super loud, and I just don't love them. Now that said, they can be a semi-necessary evil if you've got a lot of material to remove. Now there's a great video that Lou Shazad did about taking a brand new power plane and doing a little bit of tweaking on it to make it really good for boat building purposes. And I'll leave a link to that in the corner or down in the description. Now, of course, power planes come in different sizes. I like to use this sort of small 4.5-inch ones. That's the one I've got on hand. But you can get big 6-inch models, which I've used, which are kind of nice. And you can get these big beam planers that are more intended for the timber framing industry. It's just like the planer head with some rollers on it. You drop onto a beam and push it along. So now that we've been through all of the handheld power tools that I have in my shop and looked at the different ways I use them, I thought I would just boil those down to what would my very, very basic kit be. Now let's just imagine you're starting out from scratch. You had absolutely nothing. Maybe you've got, we'll say, $1,000 to $1,200 to spend. First off, 100% drill driver combo, and I would pick ones that are sort of not the smallest, even though I prefer the smaller, lighter tools. I'd pick the ones that have got enough punch to sort of do almost everything. These guys are going to run you about $250 for a kit, including a charger and maybe an extra battery. Next, I would 100% just get a regular 7.25-inch circular saw, either the Sidewinder or a worm drive, depending on what's available to me. This particular one with the magnesium base is about $320, but I would probably just go for the cheaper aluminum base one, which is about $180. Now, I think the next thing I would probably consider is, I think the belt sander. I go for sort of the mid-size belt sander. This is going to run you about $320. The bigger one I have is probably $100 more than that. And the reason I would pick a belt sander over a random orbital sander is that this can actually do some heavy shaping for you. A random orbital sander will save you some elbow grease, but this will be a bit of a game changer when it comes to really moving a lot of material quickly. And so when we think about cost effectiveness for the effort it saves you in doing something, a circular saw is going to save you a heck of a lot of sawing time. This is going to save you a heck of a lot of shaping time. A random orbital sander, cosmetic sanding at best, and I don't think that that is something that is really worth throwing money into when you got something else that can save you a lot more effort. So I would go with the larger belt sander. A laminate trimmer is what I would get because it's going to allow me to do a lot of smaller detail work, like knocking corners off things, some small chamfering of things that you can do that stuff by hand, but you can do it quickly and effectively with a laminate trimmer. Plus, this can help me with chopping pockets into things. It can help me with trimming things flush. There's a lot of jobs I can do with a laminate trimmer, and so I would probably consider having one of these. That's going to run you probably about $140 or something. Definitely, I would get a glue gun. And of course, I don't know what that's going to run you. Probably, we'll say let's get a good one at like $50. I think I spent probably a bit more than that on this one. But if you can get a cordless one, by all means, because these corded ones are kind of a pain to have. But for putting patterns together and temporarily holding things, a glue gun's really hard to beat. Now, the last thing, and I almost hesitate to do this because I did talk about how I hardly use it myself, and that would be a jigsaw. And the only reason I suggest this is because this will take the place of what you might put a bandsaw to doing. Cutting really tight turns and things. If you had to cut a quarter knee or a breast hook out, probably the jigsaw is about the only thing you're going to do that with quickly and effectively. So as much as I hate to suggest the jigsaw, I'm going to suggest the jigsaw because in the absence of other equipment, this is going to do something that nothing else can do. So a jigsaw is going to run you about $230 for one not unlike this. In fact, I would just check what the price of this one would be, and you know what? The design has totally changed. This little top turning knob is all gone. And that, whereas when I looked at the Makita equipment, this sander, which I've had for 20, 30 years, is exactly the same virtually as the one that's still on the shelf. So that's what I was saying about, I like about Makita, is the fact they seem to have sort of come up with a good design, and they've stuck with that design. It's still the same. These guys, they're constantly re-innovating. And I think innovation's great, but it kind of suggests to me that they kind of didn't do as good a job of it the first time around. This whole kit is about 1100 to 1200 bucks, roughly speaking. For about $1,000, you can get a 6-piece Makita 18-volt cordless set. So that's actually a pretty good start to things. Now, you don't need all of those tools necessarily for boat building, but $1,000 will get you a bunch of tools that will be pretty useful for boat building, all in a cordless format. Can you save money? Can you trim down the cost of all of these things? Well, of course you can. You go out shopping in the used tool market, you're going to find a circular saw that's perfectly capable, for 50 bucks or under. You're going to find, I'm not sure if it's worth looking for used drill drivers, because these things take a pounding. So if there's one thing you should definitely probably buy new, it's drills and drivers. I don't know that you're going to find much in the way of laminate trimmers in the used market, but certainly larger routers for sure you'll find. And you'll probably find some belt sanders kicking around. I don't think you're going to find a decent jigsaw. You'll find really junky D-handled ones. So probably I would shop around for a brand new jigsaw. And this is where, newer technology is definitely worthwhile. And if you can try one out before you buy it, even better. The only things I would really add if I needed to flesh this out a bit more would be the fine multi-master, but that's a bit of a big ticket item there. Of course, there are the cheaper models that probably another 100 bucks will get you a multi-tool made by somebody. And because I use it so much, the cordless trim saw, I would definitely want to add that to the pile. So as I said at the beginning, we never buy a whole pile of tools all at once. We start out buying one tool at a time as the need arises. And I encourage you to sort of take your time acquiring tools, because the amount of innovation that you can apply to any individual tool that you own is going to add to a level of experience that is going to benefit you in the long run. I know there's a whole lot of blue in my collection, but there's some yellow, some red, and a splash of orange here and there too. So I'm not necessarily completely brand loyal to Makita, but I have found that they have produced quite a few tools that are to my liking over and above the other companies. But you make your own choices. Everybody makes a decent tool of some sort. I hope you'll find this video was helpful, making some informed choices when it comes to buying handheld power tools for your boat building needs. Now stay tuned to this channel, because we'll be back with another video about which stationary machines I use in wood boat building. I want to thank all of my followers on Patreon, whose financial assistance makes these videos possible. And if you can join me on Patreon, I really appreciate that. You can find links in the corner or down in the description. So please join us again, where we get our hands dirty having good, clean fun. Ciao for now, folks.